Good afternoon, or whatever time we feel it is, to everybody. So, again, welcome to this press conference, which is kicking off the first World Conference on Climate Impacts happening in Potsdam from today till Thursday. So, my name is Joachim Schellnhuber. I'm Director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and more or less the local host here together with my colleagues. Now it's a big pleasure and an honor to have here on the panel a number of eminent decision makers as well as scientists. So let me start. So the person to my left, so that is European Commissioner for Climate Action, Connie Hedegaard, fairly well known. So we have Rachel Kyte, Vice President for Sustainable Development of the World Bank, and clearly a driving force behind the interesting new developments in the World Bank, but she may comment herself on that or not. So when we have Joe, you are here. Joe Alcamo, who is the Chief Scientist for UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program, actually the first chief scientist ever established under the new system. And here is my old friend, Pavel Kabat, who is director of the Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Luxembourg, near Vienna. So I think, the two gentlemen represent, if you like, the cream of integrated climate change science, while the two ladies clearly are at the helm of important institutions where the policy about climate change has to be made. So let me very briefly say a few words, and then the others will make initial statements, 3 or 5 minutes, something like that, and then we open the floor clearly for the discussion. We try to keep the language to English really here, so you may perhaps ask a question in German, but when the answer clearly will be in English here. But if you can formulate your question in English, that would be preferred, definitely. Now let me say, this is a world first event, definitely, because for several hundred scientists and stakeholders from many countries come together today here in Potsdam to, if you like, paint the big picture of how our world would look like in the future if the planet would warm by, say, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, or maybe even 6 degrees. And you know, this is different from the question, is the planet warming and is humankind responsible for that? This question is being answered by climate system science. You have the big computer models and so on. And more or less the answer is clear. Yes, there is human interference with the climate system. But it becomes much more complicated if you ask yourself, now what are the consequences of that? 4 degrees world looks very abstract, so to speak. So, for example, we did a report for the World Bank called Turn Down the Heat. It was about the consequences of 4 degrees warming. And when you look into things like extreme events, heat waves in the tropics, for example, you look at sea level rise, you look at agricultural production. But in the end, you have to sum it all up and to ask yourself, what would it mean for the stability of certain societies, communities, nations actually? Yeah? How about Southern Africa, for example? Could there be a destabilization of the current system, of the current regimes, if food production becomes extremely expensive, and if this would in the end lead to social tension, things like that? So you can imagine that climate impact research is, first of all, radically interdisciplinary and is confronted with the biggest complexity you can find in modern science, actually. Now, 2 things are to be achieved at this conference. First of all, it is community and capacity building, if you like. That means the people who come together here try to identify gaps, try to find priorities, set an agenda for the next, if you like, 10 years or so on, for the international community. But the other thing is clearly having a political impact in the sense that, yes, in 2015 the plan is at least to have a global climate agreement that deserves the name. There will be the conference in Paris. And when the decision makers have to be fully informed about the choices to be made. The choice between a 2 or 4 or 6 degrees world sounds very sort of academic. We will actually put flesh on the bones in a sense. We will make clear what it means, what the tough choice really is in the end. So that's the second goal of this conference. And I'm sure that the other people on the panel will make appropriate comments on that. So I'll just hand over to you, Connie.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for the invitation to be here, but also thank you very much for your constant work on trying to communicate what the climate challenge is all about, seen from a scientific point of view. I think it's absolutely key that the political community and the scientific community sort of come together, because you cannot, in a time where people, for very good reasons one could argue, are extremely preoccupied with the short term. Do I have a job tomorrow? What is my country's financial situation next month or next quarter? It goes without saying that they're also to ask people to think for the medium term and for the longer term, and to give a green light for their politicians trying to think for the longer term, which I believe is the job also for politicians. They have to do that. But that is incredibly difficult if there is not very clear facts, knowledge, and scientific information out there. I was in my home city of Copenhagen this weekend, and there, last week some knowledge came out that maybe things are slowing down a bit, because we have, yes, passed the 400 parts per million, but did the temperatures really follow suit? And I think the interesting thing is that there is something in the nature of man that makes us grasp this, so that you immediately find the headlines, climate change is postponed, or we can wait to do something, you know, that sort of headlines. Although if you sort of came down into the details, you could see, no, it just meant that maybe we have a bit more time actually to get done what is needed to be done. So I think this alliance between having the facts, the knowledge, the information, the communication from the communities, from the scientific community, that is absolutely key for us who are politicians and regulators to try to take the right decisions, even in a time of crisis. And there, my last point is just to refer to one very important step forward taken last week in Europe, where we had our heads of states to discuss energy policies on Wednesday at the summit, the European summit. And I must say that I'm quite proud that despite all the other challenges they were discussing and they have at hand, they actually managed to come out with a very clear message. Yes, they want the Commission now to move forward, coming with proposals for what should be the European climate and energy targets for 2030. As you might know, we came out with a green paper end of March, and already now the heads of state said, that's fine, we saw that, we welcome that, and now we ask you also to come with the proposals before the end of this year, so that we can return to this issue March 2014, March next year. So I think sometimes dealing with climate change is very much uphill these days, but I think that we have managed so far in Europe to show that now and then, even at the highest political level, there is a will not just to think for the shorter term, but also take the necessary decisions for the longer term. And last week was a very good proof of that.
Rachel?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. The World Bank Group is is an economic development institution working with more than 180 countries around the world. And we're here because we firmly believe that climate change is one of the most significant threats to long-term economic development. It's not just an environmental issue. This goes to the very heart and core of how countries are going to build their competitiveness, how they're going to build prosperity, and how they're going to, in the case of poor countries, actually manage their way out of poverty. We're here as well because we constantly have to be able to answer the question from our client countries of how do we adapt, what are we expected to adapt to, what are the scenarios. And so it's very important for us to be able to have the kind of partnership we have with Professor Schellnhuber and his colleagues, so that we can, as an economic-based organisation, put our arms around the science and be able to bring the science and economic decision-making together and think through together with the client countries that we work with, what are the possible ways forward, as Connie already said. It's one thing to understand the downside of what might happen, but our job is to help countries think through how to plan a pathway of growth which is sustainable, which is greener, which is less emitting, and which is also focused on the resilience that agricultural systems, cities, transport systems will have to build in order to be able to cope with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees of temperature rise. And so it's very important for us to be able to mobilize action so that countries can invest in their own resilience in the face of what the science is saying is ahead of us. But it's also very, very important for us that we make the case for aggressive action to mitigate climate change, because mitigation has now become the most important form of adaptation for many of the countries in which we work. Just investing in resilience alone is not going to be sufficient. And so making the case for those countries that need to take aggressive action on mitigation becomes part of not only the sensible economic thing for us to do, but it's also the moral thing for us to do. And so bringing science and economics together in order to work through what are the possible pathways forward becomes very important. And I think it becomes very important when it's communicated in that way in order to support those who need to take ambitious national decisions in order to get the kinds of action that we need now rather than later. The final thing I'd say is that for many of the countries in which we work, it is very clear that this is not a future potential threat, but it is a clear and present danger today. Whether it's from the extreme weather events that they have experienced in the last year or so, or expect to experience in the next few years, if it is the disruption to their food systems at a time where food security is still a problem around the world, if it's their need to fill the energy gap and meet their energy needs, but to do so in a way which doesn't mean that they are locking themselves into the wrong kind of decisions for the long run, or whether it's the fact that we expect the number of people to live in a water-scarce situation to double over the next 10 to 15 years. So countries may be talking about food security or water security or energy security, but at the end of the day, the solutions to that are going to be found in the merging of science and the kind of economic and development choices that they have. And that's why it's so important for us to be the kind of partner that we hope to be with Potsdam, and why we're so pleased to be here with so many scientists from around the world. Thank you very much.
So, thank you, Rachel. So, Joe, would you like to follow?
Hello. Thank you very much, John. It's on. Yeah. So, UNEP, together with the science community, has pointed out to countries that there's an emissions gap that we're headed for in 2020, namely between the emissions level in 2020 that we're aiming for in order to stay within the 2-degree target and the emissions level we're headed for if you just follow through on the country pledges to reduce emissions. It's a big gap between 8 and 13 gigatons per year. Now, if we do manage to close that big gap, then we'll have a fairly high level of confidence that we'll be on a pathway to no larger than a 2-degree temperature increase in this century. That's not 0, but that's 2 degrees that we would have to adapt to. The scientists tell us that if we don't manage to close the gap, we'll be more likely to be on a trajectory to 2.5 to 5 degrees. So the issue is, are we ready? Is the world aware, first of all, that there's a certain amount of climate change inevitable, even if we manage to close the gap of at least 2 degrees, but it may be higher. Now, one has the impression anyway, I have no scientific facts to back this, that a lot's going on in Europe, internationally and nationally, both scientists and policymakers working out solutions to adapt to an anticipated climate change. It may not be so clear that we're ready in the rest of the world. UNEP's pointed out that in Africa alone, in order to adapt to climate change, we need roughly, in this decade, around $5 to $30 billion per year in this decade. And within 15 years or so, it's going up to double that, $6 to $60 billion per year. It's not clear that that kind of funding is becoming available to deal with the adaptation challenge, and therefore we may have a kind of action gap between the actions we need to take and the actions we are taking at this moment. We also probably have an ecosystems gap, I call it, and that is we're not taking advantage of nature's ability to provide adaptation services. For example, something as simple as the thickness of mangroves lining the coastline in the tropics provides a very effective buffer against storm surges associated with climate change. But nevertheless, in the last 2 decades, we've managed to destroy about one-third of the total mangrove area in the world. So we have what looks like an action gap. We may have an ecosystems gap, and almost for sure we have a knowledge gap, because I think we know enough to act. We know enough about coastal protection and sustainable agriculture to act. But I would say we need to know more to act well. We need to improve our knowledge about where the impacts are occurring, about the solutions particular to particular areas, and actually how to implement these solutions. So I'd say we have 2 big tasks facing us. First of all, that we need to close the gap, because the less the temperature increase, the less the temperature and precipitation changes, the less we have to adapt to. But since a certain amount of climate change is unfortunately inevitable, we have to get ready, and that's the second big task, to get ready, to start acting on the stuff we know well, like sustainable agriculture and coastal protection, and to build up the knowledge where we don't know how to act well enough in adaptation.
Okay, thanks a lot, Joe. So, last but not least here for the introductory round, Pavel Kabat. I should mention that this conference is co-organized by the Potsdam Institute together with IIASA in Luxembourg. So we are the 2 people to be blamed if something goes wrong.
Thank you, John, for this introduction. Commissioner, all panelists, colleagues. I do represent an institute which is called IIASA, International Institute of Applied System Analysis, from Austria, Luxembourg, close to Vienna. What is this? Established in 1972 at the top of the Cold War by Soviet Union and United States as a bridge through science between divided world. At present, Institute consists of 20 countries, all the major economies of the world, to look into the issues of global transition, global change, and climate is at the heart of our institute. We have close to 3,000 people around the world associated with us, and IIASA has been involved in climate from the very beginning. It was in 1980 where the first report appeared from IIASA with the global community about CO2 and climate. And it was at IIASA where the stress scenarios which underpinned the last 3 reports were actually made. I would like to leave you through the first statement with 3 statements here. Number 1, magic word, uncertainty. First question which I would like to answer and will answer in my lecture today is, does uncertainty in science, in climate modeling, prevent us from doing adaptation? My answer will be no. We know enough at this moment to start to do responsibly in a co-engineered, co-designed mode with the policymakers, with investor adaptation. I will give you evidence this afternoon in my presentation. Number 2, are we using in climate adaptation and discussions good narratives? My answer is no. We should change the narratives from threat only to the positive narratives. Climate adaptation means opportunity to be innovative in R&D, in investment, but also in business. Number 3, go for cross-sectoral thinking. Climate is not a sector. Climate is a cross-cutting idea, system type of thinking, as Mr. does, which cuts through all the sectors. It's kind of deadlock to think about only climate investment. So my plea will be go for cross-sectoral implications, cross-sectoral investment, cross-sectoral policies. One of the studies IIASA published last year was a so-called global energy assessment, which provided most probably comprehensive assessment of energy systems in the world so far. It was done not only for the energy, to bridge the gap, to give 2.5 billion people, give it access to energy, and scenario for the future. It also did it under the condition of the global warming below 2 degrees and under the condition of the air quality standards in major megacities. The funny part of it was that if you would do these 3 policies until 2050, sectorally, doing everything you can to achieve the climate objectives, to do the energy access and availability, to do air quality control, the overall cost globally will be about 1.2% of the GDP, global one. If you do it together synergetically, across the sectors, it's only 0.8. So there is actually a win-win situation in thinking cross-sectorally, and the climate could be a good broker for these policies.
Okay, thanks a lot. I may just add here before we start the question and answer mode, is that people often ask you as scientists, in particular here in Germany or in Europe, now all these debates about global warming, do they really affect us here? So maybe it will be very bad in the tropics and coral reefs may be destroyed, things like that. But what about Central Europe, for example, or the Mediterranean? Now there is a recent study which actually will be also discussed here is that tells us that in Europe, if climate change is not restricted, it may consume about half of the expected welfare increase in our countries. So everybody assumes, of course, GDP will grow, welfare will increase, human living conditions will be better, but 50% of that might be eaten up by climate change alone. And I'm not speaking of countries like, say, Bangladesh or Somalia or Ecuador, which would be much more heavily impacted by global warming. So yes, other countries in the world are more vulnerable than Central Europe, but we are vulnerable too. So I'd like to invite you now, and I'll hand over actually to Jonas Fearing, a press officer who will take questions, but he will not answer them actually.
No, I won't. Thank you very much for your statement. The floor is open for Q&A, and I'd like to ask you to first ask questions. I'd like to ask you to first ask your questions to Ms. Kyte and Ms. Hedegaard, as the two of them have to leave at 1:40. First to those. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I would like to know. Which mitigation technologies you would prefer. At the EU level, there, for my opinion, is a shift more or less from renewable energies to other mitigation technologies like gas or maybe new nuclear power plants and so on, more efficiency. Are the renewable energies the most important mitigation technologies? Do you agree with such a shift at the EU level? What do you think about that?
And sorry, I forgot to ask, but could you identify yourself, just saying your name?
Yeah, my name is Stephen Hanke. I'm from Energate. It's a news agency for energy topics in Germany.
Yeah, please.
Well, I would not sort of rank different solutions. Renewables is definitely a very important component, and it stays like that. It goes without saying that if we have to reduce in the magnitude of 80 to 95% by the middle of this century, then renewables will play a part in this. But you mentioned nuclear, you mentioned gas, all sorts of technologies, including bridging technologies, can have their role in the whole European system. But I would mention one thing that you did not mention, and that is energy savings, energy efficiency. I think that even in Northern Europe, where we have been addressing this for many years, there is still a huge potential there. I'm going later today to Bulgaria, where we launch a campaign with a very positive narrative tomorrow in Bulgaria. But I mean, in a country like Bulgaria, or take your neighbor Poland, there is a huge potential for energy savings. And the very big advantage here is that that will be good for our macroeconomics to bring down our energy costs and our energy bills. It will be very good for employment, because if you retrofit building or expand your grids, make your infrastructure much more efficient, that creates jobs that cannot be outsourced to China or elsewhere. So the good thing about, for instance, energy efficiency is that it addresses all our three crises in Europe: the economic crisis, the job crisis, and the climate and energy and resource crisis. So I would also mention energy savings.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so please, in the last row. No, actually, your colleague, you asked.
Hallo, Chris from the Rundfunk Berlin-Brandenburg. How do you see the role of the future role of coal in Europe and especially in Germany?
I think that coal will be in Europe for a while. That goes without saying. But I also think that it would be a mistake if we are now expanding a lot our capacity in coal, for instance, because we do not have a price signal in our emissions trading scheme that actually works. And I think that's what you're referring to right now. Even very efficient gas plants are not cost efficient because the price of emissions have come down too close to zero. That is not a sustainable model for Europe, also economically, if we really want to go for the low-carbon society by 2050 that all 27 member states have subscribed to. So I would say that coal will be in Europe and in the energy mix of Europe for many years to come, but that is not where we should be expanding things. We should be expanding things in many of the alternatives, and one of the ways to create the incentive for that is to get it right on the pricing on carbon. And that's why some of us are still waiting for Germany.
Okay. Lady in the second row.
Well,
This is just for the live stream.
Britta Hibbert,
I think.
ZDF
Yeah.
German television, yeah.
Yeah.
Let me just add to this. If you're talking about incentives to reduce use of coal, in particular in the case of Germany, what sort of incentive can the EU give, or any other worldwide institutions?
I can only say that there are two things. The one thing is what I mentioned, to have a decent price on pollution, have a price on carbon. That is the best thing we can do at the European level. Of course, also to help investments to come through. That is what we're trying to do through the EU budget and also through the structural funds, to earmark much more of the budget towards energy and climate efficient solutions. So that's what we can do from the European level. But many of the things that you're probably implying or referring to in your question, many of the things will have to come from here, the federal level or Länder level. But the tool we have, that is primarily a price on carbon and getting the targets right. And of course also there are lots of regulation we can do at the European level. To which Germany has to agree, and so far it normally goes well. We have some challenges. I can see in your press today that there is quite some attention around the CO2 and in cars and things like that. But it's actually an area where Europe, if we make intelligent regulation, we can help to pull innovation forward. And if there is one thing we need in Europe these days also to boost our competitiveness, then it is to look more into innovation.
If any of you on the panel would like to comment on one of those questions, you're of course free to do that. So I'd like to invite all of you to also profit from the fact that we have Rachel Kyte with us. She'll also leave in just 10 minutes. And she's a rare gem to have here in Germany, in Potsdam. So please. So the gentleman in the last row center.
Mr. Schellnhuber, you mentioned Bangladesh, Colombia, and Somalia. What are the gaps between regional climate models and global climate models? How do you think to close them? And how do you want to deal with all the uncertainties in the models up to a prognosis?
Okay, so everybody else may leave the room now. This is a big... Yeah, of course. And Pavel will also stay. No. First of all, I mean, there is a brute force approach, as we call it, and there is an intelligent approach to closing the gap between sort of global climate modeling and regional modeling. I mean, the brute force way simply is you increase the resolution of your model, no? Down to hopefully 1 kilometer, something like that. And for that you need a super computer, which is going to be built maybe in 10 years from now. It will work, actually. It will cost a lot of money, and it is fairly slow to do that. You can do it in a more intelligent way, what we call a sort of deterministic statistical approach, that means you just look at the past, so to speak. If you have certain pressure systems over, say, Iceland, when you will have some implications for Central Europe, for example. You just look at the patterns and you feed them into your model, and an intelligent combination of the two things is speeding up your calculations by a factor of 1,000, maybe. So it's much faster in the end. But this is still not a prediction. I mean, here in science, in particular when it comes to climate impact research, we strictly differentiate between projections and predictions. A projection means you take a scenario, you have all types of uncertainty, but you still can come up with a very consistent narrative, if you like, of how it would look like. So, for example, we have looked in the context of the World Bank inquiries at various regions, in particular Southeast Asia, so the Philippines, for example, very vulnerable. South Asia, in particular India, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And you see a picture, a very robust picture emerging for India, for example. You will see that in a 4 degrees world, if you take all the models we have now available, there is a consistent narrative that in the dry season, India will become even drier by up to 30%. That's a lot. And in the wet season, many parts of the country will become even wetter by up to 30%. So the seasonality will increase heavily. Now, once we will have, of course, one day we will have models which can go down to 1 kilometer resolution. But we will just repeat that story. Now, for decision makers, why am I saying this? In India, because there was the question how to mitigate greenhouse gases and so on, and renewables would be a first choice. Now in India, people think about building much more hydropower. So we want to build another 100 gigawatt or something of hydropower. That would mean the equivalent of 100 nuclear power stations. But where do you do it? You do it in the northeast of the country. Now, if the summers will run dry in the future, this would be stranded capital. It would cost 20, 30, 50 billion or even more, but there wouldn't be enough water in the future. Now, this is a message we can convey to the region already now, although we cannot predict whether on the 23rd of April 2071 it will be a shiny day in Assam.
So I'd like to repeat very last opportunity to ask questions to Rachel Kyte and Connie Hedegaard and Mr. Kicksmiller.
Question to Mr. Schellnhuber. Colleagues of you from the Oxford University just found out that global temperature is not rising so high. It's a little bit less, 1 to 4 degrees. And since 1998, global temperature is not very much rising anymore. On the other hand, we have the highest carbon concentration in the atmosphere. Is it a contradiction? Can you explain the background a little bit?
Okay, I have actually answered this question 3 times today, but it is very pertinent, and actually Connie Hedegaard has already alluded to that, because now, first of all, this was a sort of Lisa brief, a correspondence to Nature Geoscience, which was done by actually former members of the Potsdam Institute who work now at Oxford University. Yeah? And if you read it carefully, it tells you two different things. The first one is that the long-term projections of the climate models are confirmed, actually. Yeah? So it means the big picture is intact. The second is just taking into account what you said, what happened over the last 15 years, since the big El Nino event in 1998, actually. So there has been a slowing of global warming at the Earth surface, which is very important. And taking that into account, simply the projections, again projections, for the next 2-3 decades have been revised a little bit to the lower side, actually. Yeah? So this is no surprise, because everybody can see that we didn't have a steeper rise in global mean temperatures in the last decade as we had in the previous decade. But if you now analyze this, why does it happen? And there have been a number of very important scientific papers on that recently, which did not make it to the media, is people had analyzed where does the heat go to. Because if you look at satellite data at the top of the atmosphere, you clearly see we have an excess of energy. More energy is going into our planetary system than is going out. This is the first law of thermodynamics. Energy is conserved. So it has to go somewhere. Now, obviously, most of it is now going into the deeper layers of the ocean. No? And you have to appreciate where the top 3 meters of the oceans globally contain as much heat as the entire atmosphere. So if things are going deeper down, then of course you will have a certain slowing down of what is happening at the surface. So what we probably see now is a sort of saturation of deeper ocean layers with the heat, but once that job is done, the surface will warm again, and even faster actually later on. This is, by the way, accompanied, if you look at the data as I just did this morning, you had many more La Nina events, that is the cool phase in the Pacific, in the last decade than you had in the previous decade. And this is, in a sense, precise. In a La Nina event, the oceans more or less take up heat, while in an El Nino event, they release heat. So just wait for the next big El Nino, and then we will have a boost in global mean temperatures. So again, what does it tell us? It simply tells us that global warming does not happen in a linear way, that every year the same amount of warming happens. Nobody was actually expecting that. We always talked about natural variability. So I'm, as a physicist, not at all surprised. And there is no reason, unfortunately, there is no reason to call off global warming.
So the gentleman over there did want to ask.
Rundfunk. Finally, I've got a question to Rachel Kyte. We saw that the fast-track finance, talking about adaptation, we have to talk about adaptation financing. The fast-track financing that trickled into the fund, and I think the goals were achieved, but we have a big gap for the future financing. Are you confident that the $100 billion will be there, will be available in 2020, or say 80 billion in 2018 or something like that?
Well, I think today neither financing for mitigation nor financing for adaptation are flowing to where they're needed sufficiently. Adaptation financing, such is the situation that most developing countries find themselves in, that the uses of the funding are going to be for development needs. I mean, if you're going to be building you know, if you're in the process of urban development, or if you're investing in your agriculture, or if you're building transit systems, those are going to have to be built to be resilient to climate change. And so development finance and adaptation finance are really going to be used for the same things, but adaptation financing has to be used to make sure that things are resilient and to meet the additional cost of that resiliency. Otherwise you get stranded assets using development money, not just commercial finance, as John's already mentioned. Mitigation finance is increasingly really about mobilizing private investment in the investments that are needed to have a greener growth path, whether that's modern transit systems, whether that's energy efficiency, whether that's renewable energy, whether it's forestry, agroforestry, and changing and investments in a different form of farming, right? So if you take the big issues. Am I confident that the money will be there? Well, actually, money is not the problem. There's plenty of money in the international scheme of things. It's about finding the ways to take the money that's in the system and have it invest in the things that are needed. And that's going to require mobilization of public money that can be used to buy down the costs of more expensive investments for mitigation. It's going to be public money that can help share some of the risk that we want the private sector to take so that the investments are made now and not in 10 years or 15 years. It's also going to be then about the mobilization of domestic resources in middle-income countries. It's going to be about domestic pension funds and domestic savings. It's going to be about international pension funds, insurance companies and other long-term investors. And then it's going to be, and then the rest of the sort of commercial financial sector. If we had a price on carbon, if we had a robust price on carbon today, you would start to see those investment flows move, because they would move into the opportunities to invest in what will be the future, which is a highly resource-efficient, competitive economy. And you see middle-income countries in particular moving in that direction already. So I don't know how much money is going to be available, but I do know that there are certain things that, if they happened, that money would flow more easily, and that the actual amount of money itself is not the problem. It's unlocking that money that is the problem.
Well, thank you very much. And I don't know, you told me you got to go now, but if...
We can stay a little longer.
You stay, okay, so more opportunity for you. So in the very back over there, and then it's over there.
Thank you. Bernhard Petter for die Taz, die Tageszeitung. And a question for Ms. Hedegaard and Ms. Kyte. If I understand correctly, what everybody here started today, we'll have better scenarios in the future. We'll have scenarios and case studies for 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees world. My question is, do we really need this? Don't we have enough scenarios to act? Isn't it rather political will that is lacking? So my question would be, in your political and your economic world, how would you make use of these studies, these case studies, these scenarios that come out of this process that is going to be started here today? And the second question would be to Mr. Schellnhuber. How does this relate to the IPCC, actually? Because if I understand it correctly, the Working Group 2 of the IPCC does a similar thing. So where's the connection here? Yeah. Thank you. Okay.
Well, if I can say, of course, it's always good to have more refined and precise data. That goes without saying. The more we know, the better. But I would agree with your basic point that we should not sit idle waiting for more information. We have more than enough information in order to act, and that goes also for the global community. And you know, climate change and climate science is one reason. Another reason is that when my grandma was born in 1901, the world had just passed the 1 billion inhabitants mark. My children will be living in a world with 9 billion people. I mean, you don't have to wait for a lot more climate statistics to realize that maybe it's wise to try and get a more resource and energy efficient kind of growth if we have to accommodate the needs of these 9 billion people. So
the people that I deal with on a daily basis are ministers of finance, ministers of planning, ministers of economy in developing countries, and the question that they have, in front of them is often with limited resources, often with limited managerial sort of bandwidth within government. What am I planning for? And for many of those countries, 2 degrees, as was already said, 2 degrees is going to be something which is difficult to manage through. And understanding the impacts of 2 degrees does need to be taken down at the national level. And that information is broadly available, but then really needs to be interpreted. But then if it's 3 or 4 degrees, it's vastly different. I mean, 2 degrees might mean moving your coffee trees 500 meters further up the slope. 4 degrees might mean getting out of the coffee business. And so helping countries think through the implications of what is happening, I think, is very important. And for ministers of finance to understand the financial consequences, the investment consequences of having to plan their today and future cities in such a way that they are resilient to 20 centimetres sea level rise over the course of the next 20 years, what that's going to mean in terms of capital investment in flooding structures, etc. I mean, these are important decisions that perhaps in more developed societies we believe that we've got the planning architecture for, although let's face it, we struggle with that as well. So in these countries, these are very, very difficult scenarios through which to work, which is one of the reasons why we partner now so closely with this kind of work, because we're getting questions that we don't have ready answers to. And I think that and they have huge investment implications and huge planning implications. So, yeah, lots of science is available, but then really thinking that through, and what the work that Potsdam has done with others is show that it is location specific. So we talk about sea level rise as being globally between this and this amount, but it can be quite specific and less in one part of the world and higher in another part of the world. And that is not broadly understood necessarily by the planners and financiers in these countries.
So let me follow up, Herr Pötter, on this. I mean, first of all, I should mention, and when I'd like to convey your question on the IPCC to these two gentlemen, because we had a chat about this at lunch, actually. But first of all, IIASA did a nice study, actually. Researcher is now working with the Potsdam Institute. They looked at what it means if you make the wrong assumptions about the future warming, so to speak. Yes, you're right. We have every reason for action, but what precisely are we going to do? And it turns out if you make big adaptation investments and you shoot for the wrong target, then it's even worse than if you do nothing, so to speak. Yeah? So you have to have a clearly sort of well worked out narrative of the future. So it makes a huge difference. Of course, if the world in the end achieves 2 degrees and we all invest under the assumption that this is where we will stop global warming, and in all the sectors we'll do the right investment, it's fine. Huh? But of course you also need to think what happens in sub-Saharan Africa if we will overshoot the target. But on the IPCC, maybe Pavel and Joe, you would like to comment?
Just a couple of specific things, how this all connects to IPCC. First, everyone behind this table is connected to IPCC. I have been, for example, lead author for last 3 reports. In current one, I'm the editor of the water chapter. First, generically, the very reason for being here today was actually a realization which we made as an impact climate community about 3 years ago, that we are behind the global climate modeling community, because they've organized themselves much better. They've organized themselves by intercomparing their models, by collaborating on data, and they have been providing us with 30-plus based climate scenarios, 30 model-plus based scenarios over the last 2 reports. While the impact community used to be a group of scientists doing their own research with their own model across the world, and not really consistent, not being able to provide a consistent advice to the policymakers. So we said that has to change. It has to change very quickly, Of course, change doesn't come overnight, so what we have done together as a community, we said we would like to start first community, which will be called in the future Impact Adaptation Vulnerable Community, which will be organized as good as the climate modeling community. And we would like to put our models to study impacts on sectors, cross-sectors together in a very consistent way. And the very exercise today, which will be presented here, is called UNEP, where the best models around the world, using the latest IPCC 5 yet to come climate scenarios, prepared already, has been used to study across different models the impacts on different sectors. So this is a connectivity which I talk about. Now, these results, in a fast-track manner, have been all wrapped up in the papers which we submitted on time in January to the very distinct international journal, Proceedings of the NAS in America, about 15 papers, and we will publish on time to be able to include these references into the IPCC 5, which I think is a major success. It's the first experiment ever in this context. Of course, we are not yet done. This process must be followed, because I believe, and we believe together, that the impact community needs to be organized in this complex world of advising and actually providing substantiation for the innovation investment.
Thank you. Joe? Let me just say briefly that I think we know enough to act, but we need to know more to act well. I think that's what it comes down to. That I think we know enough to act. It's a no-brainer to say that we need to climate-proof our infrastructure, for example, against climate variability, as well as our agriculture. Whatever we do in those sectors, chances are that there'll be a net gain. On the other hand, if we want to go forward and take economic decisions, if we want to alter land use planning, if we even want to talk about, which some people are seriously talking about, evacuation of low-lying islands, then we need more concrete, more specific information. So act, but increase our knowledge at the same time.
So, time's almost up. The very last question goes to the first German television.
I have two questions to Connie Hedegaard and Joseph Alcamo. Do you think the science is doing enough? And what do you expect from science?
Well, I would say yes. I think that there is a lot going on in the scientific community, and I think that we saw some years back when we had the last IPCC report what a difference science can make, and also when science actually communicates what they are doing. And that is the need I see. You know, as a politician, you sometimes feel you have to repeat and repeat and repeat yourself, and then when you cannot bear listening to it anymore, you still have to repeat yourself. And I know that that is challenging for scientists, because they also want to move on to the next academic paper and the next analysis and the next whatever. But I think that it is incredibly important also to give priority to communicate the science. We cannot expect citizens to understand why this is important if they are not time and again told why this is important. So politicians must do this work. Business must show the solutions so that they can see themselves in it, and we can sort of see how we can actually act. But still, it's extremely important that the scientists also put it on their shoulders to communicate whatever they are finding and doing.
I mean, I thought the problem always has been in this flow between science and policy is that the reward system is different. Scientists are not rewarded for working with policymakers, and policymakers generally find it annoying to work with scientists. But anyway, it works out to be that there's not enough platforms for the science and policy to come together. It was only within the last couple of years that one of the first organizations came about by which the scientists could come together that work on climate impact and adaptation research. It's called PROVIA, Program of Research on Vulnerability, Impacts, and Adaptation. And that's just about 2 years old. So what we're missing are places where scientists can meet with policymakers and where there's a mutual gain in coming together, and where each of their reward systems do reward them for exchanging information. I mean, certainly scientists could do much more in working with policymakers. That goes without saying.
No, I think we have to turn now, because we have a very interesting video message from Prince Charles we must not let him wait. And I'd like to thank you all for your interest. We could have gone on with the questions, but thanks for your attention, actually. And now we move on to the big show.